He thought I was going to take our class. I'm sure that he didn't.
Well, good morning, everyone. If you have your Bible, we're going to get started in Ruth chapter 2. Ruth chapter 2 is where we will begin today as we continue our study through this very beautiful book. Before we jump into the text, I want to thank you all again for inviting me to come back. This is the very first time that a church has invited me 2 years in a row to participate in a gospel meeting. So I'm very encouraged by that. Thank you all. And I also want to say thank you so much for your kindness and your generosity. Many of you have reached out to me over the past year as you knew that I was getting married, and 9 months later, my first son was born. So lots of you have sent encouraging cards and letters and gifts in the mail, and that really means a lot to me and my wife. So thank you all so much for that. As I said, I've studied this morning. We'll be in Ruth chapter 2, and it will be, sorry, my mic's not on, or is it? It's not on. I don't think it's even working, but that's fine. I think y'all can hear me, but for the purpose of, I guess, the live stream, probably want to just a second. I guess while you wait, originally I had planned on teaching a class from Judges about life during the days of the Judges when the nation was without God and there was a generation of people who didn't know the Lord. But I decided to just progress through the book of Ruth instead of stepping into the book of Judges. So we'll just go to Ruth chapter 2 this morning, Ruth chapter 3 later this afternoon, and then tomorrow during the Bible class hour we'll conclude in Ruth chapter 4.
And they'll come back on down. Sometimes it goes out. The batteries were. Well, we'll bring that other mic back here.
The light's on.
Yeah. I think maybe the cord might be pulled or something. We'll just leave it there on your hip and then it comes on.
Okay.
Yep.
It's not on
Just wherever you want to put it.
Okay. This doesn't need to be on my ear, or can it just hang there?
Put it back up there.
Okay.
See if that's wrong.
That's good.
Oops.
Technology is good until it doesn't work.
That's right.
All right. I think we're geared up. All right. So as was stated, this is going to be a Bible class setting. So if you have any comments or questions about anything as we progress through this second chapter, feel free to speak up and raise your hand, and I'd love to hear your thoughts. In Ruth chapter 2, Ruth worked well so that she could find a male to marry and to carry her through the pain, the suffering, and the loss. The loss of her husband, the pain of a drought, and the grief that comes from suffering through an incredible drought. As we examined last night in Ruth chapter 1, Ruth's mother-in-law, Naomi, made a very discouraging statement at the tail end of the chapter. She says, "Don't call me Naomi, call me Mara." And as we determined last night, Naomi's name literally means pleasant, and Mara means bitter. And so at the end of the chapter, Naomi is essentially saying, don't call me pleasant, call me bitter. Because we saw last night that Ruth, Naomi, and Orpah experienced death in the worst possible way. But the remarkable thing is, at the end of chapter 2, Naomi isn't bitter. She's not sad. She's not depressed. She's not heartbroken. At the end of chapter 2, Naomi has a tremendous sense of hope. And so this morning, as we consider Ruth chapter 2, the question we ask ourselves is, what? What in the world happened? What happened between chapter 1 and the end of chapter 2 that caused Naomi to go from a place of pain to a place of praise? As we examine Ruth chapter 2, it all began with Ruth gleaning in the fields. The text says in Ruth chapter 2 and verse 1, "Now Naomi had a relative of her husband's, a worthy man of the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, 'Let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain after him in whose sight I shall find favor.' And she said to her, 'Go, my daughter.' So she set out and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers, and she happened to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the clan of Elimelech." So here in this passage, we see that Ruth gleans in the fields. She asks if she can glean in the fields. But before her request, the text introduces us to a man. The text introduces us to a man by the name of Boaz. And Boaz was a relative. He was a relative of Naomi's late husband, Elimelech. And the text describes Boaz as a worthy man. The ESV calls him a worthy man. Some translations say that he was a man of great standing. Other translations let us know that Boaz was a wealthy man. He was a good man. He was an honest man. We will soon see in the passage that he was a spiritually minded man. He was a worthy man. We'll also learn later in the text that Boaz wasn't simply a good man. He wasn't simply a worthy man. The passage reveals that Boaz was his family's redeemer. Redemption was something that many Jews at this time knew a whole lot about. And there were many families during this time that had a specific person who was the family's redeemer. And we'll soon see that the family's redeemer had a specific responsibility. His responsibility was to essentially get his poor family members out of binds. The law said a whole lot about the Redeemer's responsibility. We see in Leviticus chapter 25 and verse 25 that the law said, if your brother becomes poor and sells part of his property, then his nearest redeemer shall come and redeem what his brother has sold. So we see that this family redeemer had a responsibility of getting his poor family members out of a bind. Say you were so poor that you had to sell all of your property. You sell all of your property, you have nothing. And then you call on your family's redeemer. Hey, redeemer, can you buy back my property so I won't be at a loss? That was one of his responsibilities. Leviticus 25 also describes a second responsibility. In verse 47, the text says, if a stranger or sojourner with you becomes rich, and your brother beside him becomes poor and sells himself to the stranger or sojourner with you or to a member of the stranger's clan, then after he is sold, he may be redeemed. He may be redeemed. One of his brothers may redeem him, or his uncle or his cousin may redeem him, or a close relative from his clan may redeem him. So we see the Redeemer's responsibility was not simply to buy back property that a poor family member had to sell, but if you hit rock bottom, you lost it all, you were so broke that you had to sell yourself into slavery, we see a second responsibility of the Redeemer would be to buy his family member out of slavery. And so with all of that in mind, in Ruth chapter 2, we will soon see that Boaz, this worthy man, this man of standing, was his family's redeemer. In this passage, we're introduced to Boaz, and in this passage, we see that Ruth asks her mother-in-law, Naomi, a very specific question. The question that Ruth asked her mother-in-law is found in verse 2. She says, "Let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain." So Ruth asked her mother-in-law if she can go glean in the fields. Does someone know what that means? Can someone tell me what it means to glean? What in the world is she asking Naomi to do? Good. So to pick the leftovers. So to glean in the field was to collect crops after a field has been harvested. And so say I'm out farming and I'm in a vineyard and I'm picking up grapes. I pick up grapes. Some of those grapes are going to fall on the ground. I'm not going to be able to collect all of the grapes. And I'm not going to be able to pick all of the grapes off of the vine. There might be some grapes left on the vine, and there might be some grapes that are left on the ground, but I had the first pick of the grapes. To glean would be if Byron Nash, the preacher at North Hickson, came after me after I picked up the grapes, and he picks up what was left on the ground, and he picks up what was left on the vine. That's what it meant to glean. We read about this again in Leviticus. In Leviticus 19, in verse 9, the law said, "When you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not reap your field right up to its edge, neither shall you gather the gleanings after your harvest. And you shall not strip your vineyard bare, neither shall you gather the fallen grapes of your vineyard. You shall leave them for the poor and for the sojourner. I am the Lord your God." In the example that I just gave about me picking up grapes and Byron coming after me, I wasn't saying that Byron is poor, nor am I saying that he is a sojourner. It was just an example. But when I first taught this, I would say to the class, to glean was to pick up the scraps. To glean was to pick up what no one wanted. But that's not really what Leviticus 19 is saying. The grapes that are still on the vine aren't scraps. Those grapes that are still on the vine are good. God required his people to leave some of the good stuff on the vine for the poor and the sojourner. God didn't simply want the poor and the sojourner to collect what was on the ground. He wanted them to have some of the good stuff. And so as we consider this, the question we ask ourselves is, what do these gleaning laws tell us about the nature of God? And what does Ruth's request tell us about her character? So let's tackle the first question. What do these laws in Leviticus 19 tell us about God's nature?
Provisions for all his people.
Okay, God provides for all of his people. I like how you said all of his people. Good, he values all people. So here in Leviticus 19, we see that God provided for his Israelite people, his faithful people, his covenant people. But he also provided for the sojourner, the stranger, the pilgrim, the alien, the foreigner, the Gentile, the heathen, the Moabite. God takes care of those who serve him, and God also takes care of those who don't serve him. God causes his rain to pour on the just and the unjust. He sends his sun to rise on the wicked and on the good. God provides for all of his people. He makes provisions for all of his people. What else do these laws tell us about the nature of God?
Tells us somewhat about his love. I mean, that's his motivation. Is he loves his creation. He loves all of it.
Right. He loves his people. He loves all creation. And how do you think a Moabite, a stranger, a foreigner, a pilgrim would feel if an Israelite left them some of the good stuff? How do you think that foreigner would feel about the Israelite?
He would probably have a different perspective than what he had taught.
Good. He would have a great feeling about the Israelite. Man, This Israelite is so kind. He's so loving. He's so generous. He hasn't simply left me the scraps. He hasn't simply left me what was left on the ground. He left some of the good stuff for me. And so when that Moabite sees how loving and kind the Israelite is, he may think to himself, perhaps that Israelite is so loving, gracious, and kind and generous because he serves a loving, gracious, and kind God. So the generosity of the Israelite points the heathen to God. It's a beautiful picture. All right. What does Ruth's request tell us about her character? Ruth asked Naomi in the beginning of chapter 2, can I go glean in the fields among the reapers? What do we learn about Ruth from that request? Excellent.
She does not assume that she has a right to go there.
Perfect. That request expresses the humility of Ruth. She was willing to work. She was willing to work hard. She was willing to pick up the scraps. She was willing to take the leftovers. She was willing to pick those grapes off the vine herself. Ruth was a humble and contrite woman.
Even more humble than we would expect. She's willing to do all that, but she doesn't even know if she even has the right to have it.
Good. So she's humble and she's bold. It was a bold request. She was a Moabite. And she didn't really know the law like an Israelite would. And so perhaps she was just kind of taking a shot in the dark saying, hey, can I go? She was asking Naomi, would it be okay if I went and gleaned among the fields? And so we see that she shows a great deal of confidence and humility. Yes?
The safety aspects, her being a woman, later on, verse 9, it says that Boaz charged his young men not to touch her. So we talked last night about how there not being righteousness during the time of the judges. And so that's got to be on her mind, but yet she's willing to go ahead and do what she can for herself and for Naomi as well.
Very good point. So this story takes place during the days of the judges when everyone did what was right in his own eyes. There was a whole generation of people who didn't know the Lord. And so if there was a man who was out here harvesting and he decided that he wanted to have his way with some of these women in the field, he would do it. But you see, despite that reality, Ruth was willing to work. She was willing to go out into those fields. She had a great deal of confidence, humility, and courage. Yes, ma'am.
Tim, also, it says that she went after his grace, and we can compare that to, in order for us to get God's grace, we need to go after it, because it says in there, so that I may find grace. Well, we find grace from God when we have to search out, we have to search for it, and, by humbling herself. Same as that.
That's a wonderful thought. So what translation are you reading from? So the New King James says that Ruth asked, let me go to the field and glean among the ears after him in who I shall find grace. Mine says, in whose sight I shall find favor. But it's the same thing. Grace is unmerited favor. An excellent point. When we think about God, God is gracious, he's loving, he's merciful, and he's kind. God has provided a wonderful gift, the blood of his son, Jesus. But we have to accept the gift. Someone can buy us a brand new car. It's a wonderful gift, but we'll never be able to drive the car until we get the keys, until we step into the car, until we turn on the ignition. And so we see here that there was someone who was willing to give Ruth grace, but Ruth had to seek him. She had to go to those fields. Wonderful, wonderful thoughts. Yes, sir.
I think we sort of touched on it, but she was willing to go and do what she could for herself. I think later on in the text it talks about how that she actually also trusting God, but she was willing to do what she could for herself.
Yes, she was willing to do what she could for herself. And that reminds me of Ruth's statement in Ruth chapter 1, when Ruth says to Naomi, "Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people. Your God will be my God. Where you are buried, I will be buried. May nothing but death part me from you." That's a bold claim that she made to Naomi earlier in chapter 1. And in Ruth chapter 2, we see that Ruth is willing to keep her word. She said a whole lot of things to Naomi. She made a whole lot of promises. But we see here in Ruth chapter 2 that she's not someone who simply makes empty promises. She's willing to practice what she preaches. And so Ruth chapter 2 gives us a wonderful example of that. So we see at the end of chapter 1, Naomi is bitter. Don't call me Naomi, call me Mara. At the end of chapter 2, she has a sense of joy and hope. How was that possible? We see it's possible when Ruth gleaned in the fields. And it was possible when Ruth glowed in the fields. In Ruth chapter 2, starting in verse number 4, the text says, "And behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem. He said to the reapers, 'The Lord be with you.' And they answered, 'The Lord bless you.' Then Boaz said to his young man who was in charge of the reapers, 'Whose young woman is this?' And the servant who was in charge of the reapers answered, 'She is the young Moabite woman who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab. She said to me, please let me glean and gather among the sheaves after the reapers. So she came, and she has continued from early morning until now, except for a short rest.' As the passage continues, Boaz addresses Ruth. And then in verse number 12, Boaz says to her, 'The Lord repay you for what you have done, and a full reward be given to you.'" Or let me back up. Verse 11, Boaz answered her, "All that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told to me, and how you left your father and your mother and your native land and came to a people that you did not know before." So in this passage, Ruth is working in the field. She's gleaning. She's picking up the scraps. She's picking what was left over from the first harvest. And while she's working, Boaz walks by. And he notices Ruth. He notices her, and he asks his head reaper, "Who is this woman?" And the head reaper says, well, this is that Moabite woman. This is that Moabite woman who came here with her mother-in-law. She's left her homeland, and she's been serving her mother-in-law, and she's been working hard in the fields, working hard all day long. She's only taken a short break. And then Boaz and Naomi have a conversation, and Naomi is like, Ruth is like, "How did you notice me?" And Boaz says, "I've heard about you. I've heard about all of the good that you have done for your mother-in-law, Naomi." So in this passage, Boaz notices Ruth, the servant in charge notices Ruth, and Boaz hears about Ruth. Ruth glowed. So the question we ask ourselves is, why did Boaz notice Ruth? What do you suppose Ruth was doing in the fields that caused Boaz to initially see her? What are your thoughts?
Well, she has worked except for a short rest. But I also think that it's possible. Well, he knows who Naomi is. And so, because he's the Redeemer. But he's now just getting a look at Ruth who came back.
Okay, so he's working in the fields, or he's walking in the fields. He sees Ruth working, and perhaps he associates her with Naomi. That could be a thought. But initially, he didn't know who she was, right? He asked the servant in charge, who is this woman? There was something about Ruth that stood out to Boaz for him to ask the servant in charge, who in the world is this? What could it have been? Okay, she didn't look like the Israelite women. She was a Moabite. She could have been a little darker than them. She could have been a little lighter than them. Her hair complexion or her hair texture could have been a little different. Her hair color could have been a little different. She might have dressed different from the Israelite women. So possibly there was something different about her physical appearance that caused her to glow, that caused her to stand out.
Verse
Yeah.
8, he says, keep close to my young women. So I'm guessing he already knows all the other reapers. He already knows all the women who are gleaning. And here's this stranger. Okay, I don't know you.
Right. So that's the obvious answer. He was well aware of who the other women were. He knew the other women. He knew what they looked like. He possibly knew their names, but he didn't know this woman, this Moabite.
This is just a possibility, but I picture Ruth as a very, very good worker. And we can, anytime we're around somebody, carpenter, whatever it is, sometimes you can see this person here that you can tell they are a very hard worker. Maybe others are slacking off. This
Right.
person isn't.
Exactly. That's what I was thinking. Everything that you all said is wonderful and great and true. But it could also be that Ruth was working just a little bit harder than all of the other women in the field. And we know that was a fact, that she was working hard, because when Boaz asked the servant in charge, who in the world is this woman? He says, she's been working from early morning until now, and she's only taken just a short break. And so Ruth was a woman who glowed. She's a woman who was different. She was a woman who stood out. She stood out because of her appearance, and she stood out because she was a hard worker. But she wasn't someone who was simply working hard because the reaper and the servant in charge was watching. She wasn't someone who was simply working hard because she knew that the Redeemer was near. She was someone who did the right thing even when no one was watching. Because we see in Ruth chapter 1 that she left her father, she left her mother, she left her homeland, and she traveled to Bethlehem with Naomi even when the circumstances in Bethlehem for her were uncertain. No one was watching. No one was saying, oh, Ruth, you're just such a kind person. You're such a loving person. Bless your heart. I'm so impressed by the fact that you would leave your homeland and journey on with Naomi. That's not why Ruth decided to do that, because somebody was watching her. She did it because she had character. But despite Ruth not going out and telling everyone, this is what I did for Naomi, people knew about what she did for Naomi. Because in chapter 2, when Ruth asks Boaz, how come you're treating me this way? How come I found favor in your eyes? He says to her in verse 11, I'm treating you this way. I'm showing you this much kindness because I heard about, verse 11, I heard about all that you have done since your husband died, how you left your father and your mother and your native land and came to a people that you did not know before. Boaz heard about all the wonderful things that Ruth had done. Any thoughts? Yes. Sure.
Why does Boaz have maids in the field? If you leave it for the poor people, then why would who are the maids?
I have no idea. I'm sorry. I don't know. Does anyone know?
Maybe they were the poor maids that he allowed. And then he knew they were, it's a dangerous time, I think. Tim's already figured that out. So you would want to go someplace that was safe. Or second thought I had was, why is Ruth blowing? She's not harvesting that field for herself.
That's good.
She's serving her
Right. Wonderful. She's not harvesting the field trying to collect these grapes so that she can have a whole lot of grape juice, because she likes the way grape juice tastes. She's harvesting the field for someone else. She's serving other people.
No, she is serving.
Good. Very good. Excellent. Yes.
A little commentary says that the young women were there to tie up the sheep.
Okay. Thank you. Does that help, Regina? Wonderful. Yeah. So as we think about Ruth's behavior in the fields, as we think about how she was different, as we think about how she stood out, as we think about how she had a great reputation, Boaz heard all of these wonderful things. As we think about all of this, the question we ask ourselves this morning is, what do people say about you? And you don't have to answer this for the sake of being humble, or for the sake of some, you might embarrass yourself. I don't think you would. I think all of us would have people say good things about us. This isn't a question that we have to answer. It's just a question that we have to think about. Will people say that we work hard? Will people say that we work hard and we have a positive attitude when we work? Will people say that we're humble? People say that we're courageous? Will people say that we serve others? Will we be noticed by the things that we do for other people? What will others say about us? We see that people had a whole lot of positive things to say about Ruth. So again, at the end of chapter 1, Naomi, don't call me pleasant, call me bitter. We'll soon see at the end of chapter 2, Naomi is positive. She's hopeful. She has joy in her heart. How did she get to this point? As we examine Ruth chapter 2, we see that Naomi was able to go from a place of pain to peace because her daughter-in-law, Ruth, gleaned in the field. Her daughter-in-law, Ruth, glowed while she was in the field. And her daughter-in-law, Ruth, gained a great reward. In Ruth chapter 2, in verse number 8, after the reaper in charge tells Boaz who Ruth is, the text says in verse 8 that Boaz said to Ruth, "Now listen, my daughter. Do not go to glean in another field or leave this one, but keep close to my young women. Let your eyes be on the field that they are reaping and go after them. Have I not charged the young women not to touch you? And when you are thirsty, go to the vessels and drink what the young men have drawn." Then she fell on her face, bowing to the ground, and said to him, "Why have I found favor in your eyes that you should take notice of me, since I am a foreigner?" But Boaz answered her, "All that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told to me, and how you left your father and mother in your native land and came to a people that you did not know before. The Lord repay you for what you have done, and a full reward be given you by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you may come to take refuge." Then, verse 13, she said, "I have found favor in your eyes, my Lord, for you have comforted me and spoken kindly to your servant, though I am not one of your servants." Verse 14, and at mealtime Boaz said to her, "Come here and eat some bread and dip your morsel in the wine." So she sat beside the reapers, and he passed to her roasted grain, and she ate until she was satisfied, and she had some left over. When she rose to glean, Boaz instructed his young men, saying, "Let her glean even among the sheaves, and do not reproach her. And also pull out some from the bundles for her, and leave it for her to glean, and do not rebuke her." So she gleaned, verse 17. She gleaned in the field until evening. Then she beat out what she had gleaned, and it was about an ephah of barley. And she took it up and went into the city. Her mother-in-law saw what she had gleaned. She also brought out and gave her what food she had left over after being satisfied. Thank you for bearing with me through that exhaustive reading. But we see, because Ruth decided to glean in the fields, because she glowed while she was in the fields, she gained a whole lot. Because of Boaz's positive impression of Ruth, what were some of the things that Ruth received from him? Protection. Ruth received protection. Good.
I wonder if she was somewhat ostracized when she first came to this field, and maybe there was a coming together with her and some of the other women.
Okay, good. So she received protection and perhaps friendship. She was a foreigner. She was a pilgrim. She was a Moabite among all of these Israelites who she didn't know. And now that Boaz has accepted her, perhaps all of the other women in the field accepted her too. Good. Anything else?
Certain amount of security.
Okay.
Oh,
Security.
Choose her. Go ahead. Food.
Food, good.
Doing good for others and that things are improving for her situation.
Excellent. Validation. Sometimes we need validation. Sometimes we need someone to tell us you're doing a great job. And we see that here in Ruth chapter 2, there was a whole lot of uncertainty in Ruth's life. She's among all of these people who she doesn't know. They're from a different culture. They have different beliefs. They have different practices. And Ruth is likely very intimidated by some of these people. And she's likely very nervous and anxious about what she is about to do and what she is doing. But we see because Boaz accepted her, because Boaz spoke well of her, her confidence was likely strengthened. Good point. Yes.
I think of the word of dignity. You know, Boaz told his servants not to insult her. So there's a certain amount of you show dignity towards this woman.
Good. Treat this woman well. Don't treat her like she's a foreigner. Don't treat her like she's different. Treat her like you would treat your brother or your sister. Yes, ma'am.
He gave her some commands too, and she had to follow those for the protection somebody mentioned. And God does the same for us. He gives us things that we to follow for our protection, for our safety, like the other said.
Good. And that's kind of like your first point about the grace that Boaz offered. He offered her all of these gifts, but again, she's not going to be able to receive the gifts unless she does what Boaz asked her to do. Yes.
Mark mentioned food. I think it was maybe a little more than that to me. It appears like she was kind of elevated to the master's table.
Good.
Given as much food as she wanted to eat, where probably a lot of others didn't have that opportunity, and even gave her a doggy bag.
Excellent. Good. She was offered a seat at the master's table. I like that. Yes, sir.
You pointed out again, the character of God is revealed in his laws. And it's interesting that Boaz, contrary to virtually the entire nation, takes note of where Naomi has come and which God she has chosen to take refuge under.
Yes.
She's an idol. She comes from an idol worshiping country, and she rejected her gods to live under the favor of the Lord God. Whereas most of Israel at that time is doing the exact
Opposite. Right.
And then he says, I think this is absolutely incredible if we think about it. She could have left Naomi. She did not do it. She, since the time her husband died, she had served Naomi. And I think Boaz is reflecting God's character as a righteous man in showing her favor because she came and put herself under the God of Israel.
Good. So that's a fascinating point. So this takes place during the days when the judges ruled. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. There was a generation of people who did not know the Lord. And when the book of Judges says that, the book of Judges is not talking about all of the heathen people, the people who didn't know the Lord. They didn't know the Lord. But that's not what the author of Judges is talking about. The author of Judges is talking about God's people. The Israelites didn't know the Lord. The Israelites did what was right in their own eyes. And so here in Ruth chapter 2, Ruth, this Moabite, this heathen, this person who one would expect to do what was right in her own eyes, is serving the God of Israel among a group of people who you would think would be also serving the God of Israel, but they are likely not serving the God of Israel. So as Byron said, very simply, the heathen is living righteously and the people of God are living wickedly. And that stood out. Any other thoughts? Yes.
I think about any time we go through a difficulty in life, whatever it is, and a brother or sister, somebody else reaches out and helps us, how we are strengthened just by that. And what all that Ruth has gone through, and now what Boaz does for her, I guess you could word it in strength. I mean, that would be what we call a shot in the arm.
Exactly.
More than that.
Right.
To be strengthened to a great deal by what he did.
Exactly. Yes. I mean, at the end of chapter 1, Naomi is obviously depressed. She's dejected. She's discouraged. And Ruth is likely feeling the same way. And again, because of the kindness of Boaz, Ruth has that validation that we talked about. And now she has this strength to journey on. I might be doing something right. The future might be bright. Yes. Sure.
So Naomi is now calling her my daughter, and so her servant has brought her into a new family, like a closer relationship with her. And now another part of the validation is realizing no superstition is telling her, hey, this family may not be good for me. You know, she's realizing, oh, the extended family here is also righteous. And
Yes.
And so she's really gaining a lot of honor in her own family now, in a bigger family.
Definitely. Excellent. She has a new family. She left her, that's a good point. She left her earthly father and mother back in Moab, and I'm sure she loved her earthly father and mother. They were probably great people. What child doesn't love their parents? But we see now that she's in Israel, now that she's with Naomi, now that she's with Boaz, now that she's with all of these other women who are serving in the field, she has another family. She has a spiritual family. And we have that today. We have our earthly family who we love and care about. We also have our spiritual family. And in many times, our spiritual family is closer to us than our earthly family is. Fantastic. Thank you all. I love alliteration. And so when we talk about the things that Boaz gave Ruth, Boaz gave Ruth stability. We see that in verse 8. Support, safety, sustenance, succor, and satisfaction. Boaz gave Ruth more than she would have ever imagined. How does Boaz's treatment of Ruth contrast with what might have been expected in that culture? How would you think an Israelite would have treated someone like Ruth?
Bare minimum of the law.
Good. So you stole my point, but excellent. I want you to. So the typical Israelite would have done the bare minimum. The typical Israelite may not even have done that in this time because everyone did what was right in their own eyes. But the bare minimum was what? What did the law say? Right. Allow the poor and the sojourner to glean. Allow the poor and the sojourner to pick up what was left behind. Did Boaz allow Ruth to do that? Yes, but didn't Boaz do way more than that? And so the point is, we must go above and beyond for the poor and the stranger. The Christian doesn't just do the bare minimum. The Christian does more than what is expected. Boaz did more than what was expected. 1 Timothy chapter 6, the Apostle Paul writes to Timothy, as for the rich in this present age, charge them not to be haughty, nor to set their hopes on the uncertainty of riches, but on God, who richly provides us with all things to enjoy. We are to be rich in good works, generous, and ready to share. That is the type of attitude that Christians should have. We see that we are to do good. We see that we are to love, but we're to go above and beyond. We're going to do good and love people as we would love our own child. We're going to treat other people like we would treat our own wife. We're going to treat other people like we would treat our own husband. Hopefully that's good. We're going to treat other people like we would treat our brothers and sisters in Christ, even if they're not Christians, because that's the character of Christ, right? Yes, sir.
Just if they would have been worshiping Baal.
Exactly.
They would have said, Baal will take care of you. Your idols will take care of you, especially as she's from this idolatrous nation. But yet, Boaz says thoughts and prayers, but then he actually backs it up with action behind those things.
Yes. Yeah, we're not simply to do good for people who are good, for people who are righteous. We do good and we love everyone, even if they are unrighteous. Yes, sir.
So I'm thinking Boaz, again, is being reflecting his righteousness, because if you study the prophets, of course, this is long after this period of time, but if you look at the prophets, Israel is condemned for not leaving gleanings in the field. They were so self-absorbed that they took it all and left nothing.
Yes. Good. So again, Boaz did what was expected, but what was expected during this time was not even being done by God's people. He did what was expected. He did what was not even being done by God's people, and he did much more. And that should be our attitude. Very good thoughts. So again, the end of Ruth chapter 1, Naomi, don't call me pleasant, call me bitter. We'll soon see at the end of Ruth chapter 2, Naomi is positive. She has hope. How did that happen? It happened because of her daughter-in-law, Ruth. Ruth gleaned in the fields. While she was gleaning in the fields, she glowed. She stood out. Because she gleaned and because she glowed, she gained a whole lot from Boaz. But Ruth wasn't a woman who was simply receiving gifts. She was a woman who was willing to give good gifts. As the story continues in Ruth chapter 2, in verse 17, the text says that Ruth gleaned in the field until evening. Then she beat out what had been gleaned, and it was about an ephah of barley. And she took it up, verse 18. She took it up and went into the city. Her mother-in-law saw what she had gleaned. She also brought out and did what? Gave her. She gave her mother-in-law what food she had left over after being satisfied. And her mother-in-law said to her, "Where did you glean today? And where have you worked?" Blessed. At the end of chapter 1, I'm bitter. The Almighty has dealt bitterly with me. Don't call me pleasant. Now she's saying, blessed. Blessed be the man who took notice of you. So she told her mother-in-law with whom she had worked and said, the man's name with whom I work today is Boaz. Verse 20. And Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, may he be blessed. End of chapter 1, bitter. Now she's saying, may he be blessed by the Lord whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead. At the end of chapter 1, she said, the Almighty has dealt bitterly with me. Now, at the end of chapter 2, she's saying the Lord's kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead. Naomi also said to her, the man is a close relative of ours, one of our redeemers. We talked about the Redeemer. We talked about his responsibility. Verse 21, and Ruth the Moabite said, besides, he said to me, you shall keep close by my young men until they have finished all my harvest. And Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, it is good. End of chapter 1, bitter. 22, it is good, my daughter, that you go out with his young women, lest in another field you are assaulted. So she kept close to the young women of Boaz, gleaning until the end of the barley and wheat harvest, and she lived with her mother-in-law. So in this passage, we see, because of Ruth's character while she gleaned in the fields, she received a whole lot of blessings from Boaz. But again, Ruth wasn't a woman who simply received good gifts. She was willing to give. She gave Naomi an ephah of barley. She gave Naomi the food that she had left over from Boaz's table. And she gave Naomi hope. At the end of chapter 1, Naomi is hopeless. At the end of chapter 1, Naomi is broken. The end of chapter 1, Naomi is bitter. She's upset. She's discouraged. But we see at the end of chapter 2, she says the word blessed twice. She's saying the name of the Lord, Yahweh. She's speaking of Yahweh's kindness and how he has taken care of the living and the dead. She's saying that Ruth's situation is good. It's good for you. There is hope. He is our Redeemer. How wonderful Ruth's gift to Naomi was, the gift of hope. Ruth was able to give her mother-in-law hope because Ruth was willing to glean in the fields. Ruth was willing to glow while she gleaned. Because Ruth gained, she was able to give. That's Ruth chapter 2. I appreciate your thoughts and your comments. Does anyone have any final remarks as we wrap things up for the day? Yes, sir.
This could be the continuation of Rahab's story. We see Rahab taken into Israel. We know that she marries through the genealogy, that she's the mother of Jesus through the genealogies. And so this tells us the same kind of kind man that she must have met.
Yes.
To be accepted into Israel.
Yes, so we're actually going to talk about that later on this afternoon. Boaz was Rahab's son. And so perhaps Boaz was so kind, gracious, and loving towards Ruth because someone a long time ago was loving, kind, and gracious to his mother, Rahab, who was a harlot, who was a pagan woman, who was not an Israelite. Any other thoughts?
Just the idea of kind of gotten away from agricultural perspective, but the harvest is when it happens. It doesn't happen at other times. You have to go when the harvest is ready, and you have to work until it's done.
Good. Yes, excellent, excellent. Yes. It was more than enough. The text says that Ruth was satisfied with what she had, and she still had some to give. Byron.
And just the thought, Jesus was nearly killed in Nazareth for pointing out who had faith in the Old Testament. It was the Gentiles,
Right.
not the Israelites.
Good, good. Yes, sir.
Boaz instructed his servants to leave some for her that they had picked, and it just shows that they were, they worked for wages, but she worked to not starve.
Right.
But it also shows that he sacrificed his profit, just some of his profit. I mean, it wasn't that much, but the servants weren't giving up anything.
Right.
It was out of his abundance that he was giving back.
Yes, he did above and beyond. Thank you all. I hope that this format was helpful. I hope that you all were able to learn something. We'll continue this afternoon, and we will conclude the story of Ruth in Ruth chapter 4 tomorrow during the Bible class hour. I'll close with a word of prayer. Do you all have a song to lead after the closing prayer? Okay, I'll close with a prayer, and then we'll have a song, and then I assume some announcements, and then another prayer, and we'll be dismissed. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you so much for this opportunity we've had to gather together as your people and open up your word. We're thankful for the story of Ruth and the example that we have of someone who was willing to work hard and someone who was willing to work hard in the service of other people. We thank you for the mercy shown by Boaz, which ultimately points us to the mercy of Christ. We pray that we will live our lives in a way that shows appreciation to that each and every day. We ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen.
If you're able to stand and sing Redeemed.
Redeem thou our love to proclaim, redeem our love, redeem goodness and mercy, it's our for